Welcome back to Next Gen Investing. I'd now like to welcome in Kevin Green to discuss the latest and greatest, maybe not so great regarding this news, but with Apple and Alphabet, which are facing this UK probe, Kevin, regarding some of their mobile ecosystems. I tend to shake off some of these various, like, basically governing body news type events, but I will say that the UK and what's happening in the EU tends to actually come to fruition. So I do tend to trust these various headlines a little bit more. And I'm curious your thoughts and sort of the breakdown of the story.
Yeah, so the UK's Competition and Markets Authority here is obviously doing an investigation when it comes to Google and Apple, especially when it comes to the mobility platforms. So they're looking obviously at the Apple Store as well as Google's platform here, and they're looking at it from an antitrust standpoint. They do believe that they have a monopoly, and so they're going to be doing obviously a little bit more of an investigation to see how they can remedy the situation here. Now, when you're kind of looking at the scenario, this governing body is actually relatively new, so they're just starting to kick off some investigations, and Apple actually already has an investigation that's pending with them right now. So this is kind of just bringing Google into the fray here, but you're not seeing a lot of impact when it comes to the stocks overall. Apple has had a little bit of a tough time, but it has been able to try to bounce off of close to the 200-day moving average, and Google was actually positive, a lot more positive on the session, kind of fading here a little bit. But overall, this is going to probably take a lot more time in order to try to shake this out. And let's see what the remedy is going to be. Are we actually going to see a situation where they'll have to make massive adjustments to their platform, or will we see fines being levied and a settlement being made? I think that's going to be the biggest question mark for a lot of traders and investors. And once again, Jenny, this can take a very long time in order for it to be resolved. And I think that's why the market's really not paying too much attention to it.
One thing, too, that might be softening this just a little bit, KG, was I'm not sure if you caught any of President Trump's comments to Davos, but this was actually a direct part of the conversation when talking about sort of trade deficits with the EU. And I know, the UK is somewhat separate, but the conversation, I think, remains. He also mentioned, the fact that these different regulatory bodies internationally, particularly in Europe, are going after the Apples, the Googles, and the Metas, and that was something that they were not too pleased with. So with a new administration driving the ship now, we already know that there's kind of a hawkish stance when it comes to NATO participation and trying to get that spending back up as a percent of deficit. Perhaps this is going to be another point of contention for this administration with some of those different governments. Thoughts on that?
I agree with you. And actually, with the changes that we'll probably see at the FTC, it might be a little bit easier for a lot of these bigger companies to be able to maintain the current businesses that they have. And maybe we see a little bit of a fade when it comes to these antitrust or these monopoly investigations or allegations from the U.S. government. So I think that's actually a tailwind. And then you're right. I mean, maybe there will be some form of a concession that is made between the EU and the U.S. As well as the UK. In order to try to, remove some of these issues or these investigations that have been taking place. So I'm right there with you. I think once again, it's just going to take a lot more time for this to develop. And I'm not sure from a market cap standpoint, even if we do see kind of this lower deregulation here in the United States, as well as maybe a concession from the EU and UK, how much that's really going to boost stock prices. But that's probably going to give investors a little bit more confidence that we won't see these news items hit the wire as frequently as we've seen over the last couple of years.
Yeah, gosh, I do feel like it has really picked up in terms of its like consistency and in terms of the reaching powers that are trying to go after these companies. And I'm curious if you think perhaps it could affect one more than the other. I know there was the thinking Alphabet was somewhat more being targeted, but I'm just curious if I'm right in that sense of like we could see this hit major tech or we could see it maybe weigh on one more than the other.
I think Google is probably the biggest one that's at risk right now because, as we kind of talked about some of the policies here in the United States and some of the items that the FTC and the Department of Justice wanted to enact, actually kind of called for kind of dismantling their overall ecosystem and as a whole, potentially putting Chrome out of, I wouldn't say out of commission, but kind of having that spun off and doing a lot when it comes to the Play Store. And that's really not what you want to see for Google because they have built out their stack or their platform based on the data of their consumers, not only just from the hardware, but also to the software standpoint. So they're probably going to be the biggest beneficiary of relaxed regulations, and that'll probably be a tailwind for them so they don't have to completely restructure their business. Because if you have a disruption when it comes to the EU and you have to restructure your EU business, Google has to then go back and say, okay, is it smart enough for us to actually just cater to the EU and then we still operate the same way in the US, or do we actually just change the EU standards and just have that as our blanket policy or blanket framework across the globe? And that's something that would be a problem if they went down that route. It just appears that that's not going to be the case, at least here in the United States.
Final thought here, KG. We're going to hear from a lot of these companies and earnings in the next couple of weeks. Is this a big enough thing that we're going to hear some of the tech side of the story, or do they just leave this until it's a little bit more clear in the courts?
Yeah, I think they'll probably leave this until it's a little bit more clear. It's not as close of a decision or something that's a make or break, similar to what we saw for Ireland and Meta, where there was kind of this dispute going back and forth, and Ireland was basically leveraging fines against Meta, and that was actually having a material impact on their future earnings. We're not even close to that, so I'm not sure if they'll even address some of the concerns that they have regarding what's happening overseas, because it's not going to have a material impact, and once again, it's probably going to take a fairly long time in order to get this issue resolved.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. I'd be shocked if we heard it from any of these companies, frankly. I feel like they tend to somewhat brush these under the rug, which is perhaps maybe a wise business move. But we'll leave it there. Great breakdown on what is expected to be probably a story we'll continue to discuss for the better part of the next year or so. Kevin Green, Senior Markets Correspondent.